Welcome back. As we've been discussing over the past several weeks, the country is awaiting a decision from the U.S. Supreme Court that certainly suggests the end of Roe v. Wade. Former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton discussed that in a new interview with the Financial Times, and it reads in part, the level of insidious rulemaking to further oppress women almost knows no end. Clinton says, you look at this, and how could you not but think that Margaret Atwood was a prophet? She's not just a brilliant writer, she was a prophet. Clinton adds that when she was a senator, she voted against the confirmation of Samuel Alito, one of the court's most conservative judges. I found Alito was the kind of young man who, when he was at Princeton, railed against coeducation, railed against letting women into eating clubs. And that was all in the background that I read, she recalls. He honestly struck me as one of those very self-righteous types seeking to remake society. And joining us now, co-founder and CEO of the group, All In Together, Lauren Leader, and columnist for the New York Times and an MSNBC contributor, Michelle Goldberg, who writes about a changing perception of feminism. The piece is titled, The Future Isn't Female Anymore. And Michelle writes this, The Drift, a buzzy literary journal founded by left-leaning women in their late 20s, published a series of short essays earlier this year under the rubric, What to Do About Feminism. They described an ambient feeling that feminism has been sapped of cultural vitality, even as an anti-feminist backlash is gathering momentum, and that young people especially were turning against the movement. Predictably, most young Republicans agree with the statement. Feminism has done more harm than good. What was astonishing was how many young Democrats agreed as well. Nearly a quarter of Democratic women under 50 agreed, compared with only 10% of those 50 and older. It is perhaps inevitable that a movement that was the height of fashion in the last decade would start to seem passé in this one. Feminism is particularly given to cycles of matricide. What is liberating to one generation is often mortifying to the next. As the backlash gains steam, a lot of feminism feels enervated. There's been a desperate hope among reproductive rights activists and Democratic strategists alike that the end of Roe v. Wade would lead to an explosive feminist mobilization. It's far from clear whether a political groundswell will materialize. And Michelle, I'll let you take that point another step further. Are you seeing it? Are you seeing that reaction to this potential decision that's coming?
I mean, certainly there's a lot of anger and grief out there, but part of the genesis of this piece was trying to understand why there hadn't yet been, people pouring into the streets, why there was nothing on the scale of the Women's March after Donald Trump's election, or the just flurry of organizing that accompanied it. There's, I think, a feeling of exhaustion, despair, disillusionment right now that is incompatible with a lot of activism.
Yeah, it's funny, Lauren, later, right after I think Trump won and we had the women's marches and the pink hats, and a lot of people were like, well, what does that really mean? Oh, it meant a lot at the midterms. It meant a lot in terms of women turning out the vote. But I don't see that right now. What's going on, do you think?
Yeah, well, Michelle's right. There is a lot of fatigue on the left generally, and I think a frustration among women that we're going backwards, that it feels like our political system is sort of hopeless. I think the other problem is among younger women voters, there's a lack of patience in a sense. We think we're going to get everything all at once, that by turning one election, by winning the Senate, the House, and the White House, that overnight a whole bunch of things are going to happen. And that's just not the reality of how our political system, and we've talked before about younger voters and their sort of apathy about the sense that they're not getting what they want from our political leaders. And rather than that being galvanizing to work longer, harder for the long term, it's turning them off. I also think, look, I think that on the left, on the right, there has been an extraordinarily effective movement over 40 to 50 years to paint feminism as a negative. And it has worked in many ways. It has always been a complicated term. It's been one that has been controversial, but that's partially because, as you see, especially now, we've talked about before on the right, this sort of rising tide of autocracy is also tied to a rising tide of misogyny. The Southern Poverty Law Center just had a poll about this. You know, we're seeing that there is this sort of anti-woman undercurrent in the rise of this autocratic movement on the far right that's tied to Trump. It's always been very anti-woman, and in some ways, it's working.
And so, Michelle, do you agree with what Lauren just said? Is that what's happening?
I think that's a huge part of what's happening, but not the entirety of it, because you know, if it was just the right, that would be scary enough. But there's the disaffection on the left, I think, is slightly more complicated. It's not just, you know, accepting Trumpist-style misogyny, even unconsciously. It's a sense that the solutions that modern feminism proposes don't have much to say to the crises that a lot of young women feel like they're facing. You know, particularly, I think, a sort of professional class, lean-in style feminism doesn't speak to a generation that feels like the work world in general is a site of you know, hostility and oppression.
But Lauren Leader, just to close real quick, I mean, with All In Together, what are you seeing? How are women? Is anything galvanizing them, especially younger women, or are they feeling defeated?
Well, no, I think that, look, part of what we see in the work that we do is that when you make politics accessible, when you make it local, when you make it personal, when you give women the tools to engage with local leaders and see that they can have an impact, they turn out, and they do. And I think the big national sort of these sense of intractability in big issues can be a turnoff. But there are solutions, and the solution really is around getting engaged. And the more women get engaged in the political process, the more they turn out, the more they do see that they can make a difference, even in a very polarizing and difficult time.
Co-founder and CEO of All In Together, Lauren Leader, and New York Times columnist Michelle Goldberg. Thank you both very much for being on the show this morning.